Imagine discovering that the idea that has defined a nation for 3,000 years, the idea of being the chosen people, was not a divine decree, but a brilliant political strategy. An invention so powerful that it has survived empires, exiles, and millennia. What if everything you've been told about divine selection was carefully constructed for reasons that have nothing to do with heaven? In 1670, a man named Baruch Spinoza, working in his humble lens-polishing workshop, discovered something in the sacred texts that would forever change our understanding of divine election, and what he found will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith, identity, and power. Because here is the truth that will shock you. Israel was never chosen by God in the sense we have been told. Never. It was an idea forged in the fire of political necessity, for a reason that religious institutions have preferred to ignore for centuries. The rabbis knew it, they always knew it, and they chose to silence the truth, going so far as to excommunicate and curse the man who dared to reveal it. The reason why will leave you breathless, and by the end of this video, you will see the world through completely different eyes. Have you ever wondered why, of all the ancient peoples, only the Hebrews based their entire existence on an exclusive contract with the supreme deity? There is a reason for this. A reason so profound that it explains not just ancient history, but the very mechanics of power that still operate today. Spinoza, the philosopher whom his own people tried to assassinate, found that reason buried not in faith, but in political theory. I am going to tell you exactly what he discovered, and by the time you finish listening to this, you will never think about the idea of a chosen people the same way again. In 1670, a book was published anonymously in Latin, a book so incendiary that it was banned and burned across Europe almost immediately. So radical that its author knew that publishing it under his name was a death sentence. So accurate that 350 years later, it remains the most devastating critique ever written of the political instrumentalization of religion. That book, the Theological Political Treatise, forever changed our understanding of divine election. You are about to find out why. But first, a question. Have you ever stopped to think about the logic of a universal God, creator of all galaxies and every human being, deciding to have a favorite nation, a favorite team? It does not make sense, does it? The answer is not in heaven but on earth, and that is exactly where Spinoza began his investigation. Baruch Spinoza was just 23 years old when he was expelled from his own community, the Jewish community of Amsterdam. He asked questions that no one dared to ask out loud, not as an atheist seeking to demolish faith, but as a logician seeking coherence. And logic, as it turns out, is sometimes more dangerous than blasphemy. The first question Spinoza asked about Israel's choice was devastatingly simple. If God is omnipotent and universal, why would he need a specific people to manifest his power? Does the sun only shine for one garden? Think about it. If God created everything and everyone, why would he play favorites? The text of Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 6 says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." Spinoza read this and saw a fundamental contradiction. A universal God cannot have particular preferences without ceasing to be universal. You cannot be the God of everyone and have a favorite at the same time. It is logically impossible. This small logical gap was what Spinoza widened until it became an abyss. And on the other side, he found something that both the synagogue and the church had chosen to ignore for centuries. Something that would shake the very foundations of organized religion. Do you feel that discomfort? That feeling that a core belief might not be what it seems? Spinoza lived with that feeling all his life. In the 17th century, questioning God was risky. Questioning the Bible was lethal. Giordano Bruno was burned alive just for suggesting that the universe was infinite and that there could be other worlds. Spinoza knew he was walking on thin ice, but he possessed a mind that worked with the precision of clockwork. He began to analyze the Torah not as a revealed text, but as a historical document. And when he came to the concept of the chosen people, he discovered something extraordinary. The idea had nothing to do with innate superiority, but with a purely political function. Let that sink in for a moment. The concept that defined a civilization, that was a source of pride and persecution, was not an ontological status. It was not about being inherently better. It was a functional position, a role assigned for specific political purposes. But Spinoza went further. He questioned not only what the chosen people meant, but why. Why did the ancient Hebrews need this idea? This is where the story gets truly subversive. This is where religious institutions start to get nervous. For centuries, divine election was presented as a mystery of faith, an inscrutable act of God's will. It was convenient to demand obedience, impossible to analyze, impossible to refute. But Spinoza applied his logical rigor to the history of Israel. He analyzed the laws, the war narratives, the prophecies. Slowly, like a forensic historian, he reconstructed the original purpose of the election. What he discovered not only made perfect political sense, but it stripped the idea of all its mystical power. Have you ever noticed that the deepest truths, once revealed, seem obvious in retrospect, as if they had been hidden in plain sight all along? Spinoza's discovery about Israel's election was like this. But before revealing his final conclusion, you need to understand the crucible of violence and exile in which this man was forged. And you need to know why he was nearly killed for asking much simpler questions. In 1656, Spinoza was excommunicated with the most brutal sherem the Amsterdam community had ever pronounced. They cursed him day and night, when he lay down and when he got up. They forbade anyone to read his writings or approach him within 4 cubits. His crime? Suggesting that the Torah was not entirely written by Moses, that God did not have a physical body, and that angels were merely imaginings. These were logical questions, not attacks. If Moses wrote the Pentateuch, how could he describe his own death and burial in the last chapter of Deuteronomy? It is a simple question of logic. Either Moses did not write that part, or someone else added it later. For the rabbis, this logic was an existential threat. His community was made up of refugees from the Inquisition. They could not afford a dissident who would attract the wrath of their Christian hosts. They needed conformity to survive. But excommunication was not enough. One night, as he was leaving the synagogue, a religious fanatic attacked him with a dagger. Spinoza jumped away at the last second. The blade tore through his coat, grazing his skin. He survived by millimeters. A few inches closer, and the history of philosophy would have been completely different. Spinoza kept that torn coat for the rest of his life, a tangible reminder that the search for truth is a high-risk activity. It was with this scar, with this awareness of the mortal danger he was in, that Spinoza dared to dissect the most sacred idea of his people. Imagine the loneliness. Imagine the courage. Knowing that your own people want you dead for doubting and still deciding to attack the central pillar of their identity. But Spinoza was convinced that the truth, however painful, was the only form of liberation, and he was about to discover a truth that would change everything. In the 17th century, the idea of a chosen people was not just theology, it was geopolitics. The European monarchies called themselves defenders of the faith. Expanding empires used the doctrine of manifest destiny, a clear secularization of the idea of divine election, to justify their conquests. The narrative of Israel was the original template, a people chosen by God to fulfill a historic mission, a justification for war, colonization, and exceptionalism. "We are the new Israel," said the Puritans who came to America. "God is on our side." It was an immensely effective tool of power, and it was unquestionable. Because how do you argue against God's will? How do you challenge a divine mandate? You cannot. That is the point. That is why the idea is so powerful. Spinoza began his analysis by doing something radical. He read the Hebrew text as if it were a state constitution, not a sermon book. He treated it like a legal document, not a mystical revelation. And the first thing he noticed was striking. The covenant, the Brit between God and Israel, was strikingly similar to a political treaty between a king and his vassals. It had all the same elements. God offered protection and prosperity. He offered the promised land. And in exchange, what did he demand? Loyalty and obedience, compliance with the law. This was not a declaration of unconditional love. This was a contract, a binding agreement with terms and conditions. If you obey, you receive blessings. If you disobey, you receive curses. It is spelled out explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. This is contract language, not love language. And here came the key revelation, the insight that changed everything. Spinoza realized that the choice was not about being better. It was not about moral superiority or spiritual advancement. The choice was for a specific task, to found a theocratic state in a specific land. That was it. That was the entire purpose of the election. The law of Moses was not a universal moral code for all humanity. It was the civil, penal, and administrative code of the ancient Hebrew state. Think about it. Laws on agriculture, laws on property, laws on hygiene. These only made sense to a specific society in a specific place at a specific time. They were not eternal mandates given for all people everywhere. They were the legislation of a Bronze Age theocracy trying to organize itself and survive. Feel the magnitude of this shift in perspective. If the law is a political constitution, then it is only binding while the state exists. A constitution without a state is just a historical document. It has no legal force. And this is where Spinoza's logic becomes truly explosive. When the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD and the Jewish state disappeared, the contract, according to Spinoza's logic, was annulled. The election had served its political purpose, and therefore it was over. The Jews were no longer chosen because the state for which they were chosen no longer existed. They were simply humans, just like everyone else. No better, no worse. Just people trying to survive in a world that had turned against them. This idea was dynamite for Judaism. It denied God's eternal promise. It suggested that the covenant had an expiration date. For Christianity, which saw itself as the new Israel and heir to that election, it undermined its own legitimacy. If the original election was just a political arrangement that ended when the state ended, then what claim did the church have to being the new chosen people? The entire theological structure began to crumble. The entire theological structure began to crumble. But Spinoza did not stop there. If the choice was political, then the story of how that idea was forged must also be political. He returned to the historical texts and wondered, when was this idea really consolidated? When did it actually take hold? And he had an intuition that modern archaeology and biblical criticism would confirm 3 centuries later. The idea of a chosen people with a single jealous God did not arise in the time of Abraham or Moses. It crystallized much later, during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ. Do you understand the implication? The idea was not the origin of the people. It was a consequence of their near annihilation. It was not what started the journey. It was what saved them from extinction. This changes everything. Because if the idea was created during the exile, then it was created for a reason, a very specific reason. And that reason had nothing to do with divine favor and everything to do with human survival. In 1670, when Spinoza anonymously published his theological political treatise, he knew he was detonating an intellectual bomb under the foundations of Europe. The reaction was furious and immediate. The book was described as being forged in hell by the devil himself. It was banned by Catholics and Protestants alike. Spinoza became the ultimate pariah, the most infamous atheist of his time, even though he never claimed to be an atheist. He simply asked questions that no one wanted answered. But the truth, once unleashed, has a life of its own. Pirated copies of the treatise circulated secretly throughout Europe, read by candlelight by the philosophers who would ignite the Enlightenment. Slowly, methodically, the idea that religion could be analyzed as a political phenomenon began to spread. It was a dangerous idea, but it was also liberating. Because if religion was political, then it could be questioned. It could be analyzed, it could be changed. Spinoza had revealed the what and the when, but the why was even deeper. Why was it so crucial for post-exilic Jewish leaders to cement this idea of exclusive election? What did they gain by transforming a tribal god among many into the one and only universal God who, however, had only one favorite people? It seems contradictory, does it not? A universal God with a particular favorite. But there was a reason for this contradiction, and it was brilliantly strategic. The answer to these questions would only become apparent when modern historians analyzed the trauma of the Babylonian exile centuries later. What they found was a priestly class desperate to prevent the extinction of their people, and to do so, they resorted to the most powerful tool of social engineering ever devised: an irresistible narrative, a story so compelling that people would die rather than abandon it. The cuneiform texts of Babylon tell the story of a vast and multicultural empire. When the Babylonians conquered a people, they did not just take their land. They deported their elites to the capital. There, exposed to a richer and more powerful culture, most conquered peoples simply assimilated. Their gods were forgotten, their customs dissolved, they became Babylonian. It was efficient, it was systematic, and it had worked for centuries. The Judean leaders exiled in Babylon saw this process head-on. They watched as their people began to adopt Babylonian names, Babylonian customs, and Babylonian gods. They were facing total cultural erasure. Within a generation or two, the Jewish people would cease to exist as a distinct group. They would disappear into the melting pot of empire, and the leaders knew it. Their solution was a political stroke of genius. Led by figures such as the prophet Ezekiel and the scribe Ezra, they rewrote and compiled the ancient legends and laws of their people into a grand, unified narrative, the Torah. This was not just a collection of old stories. This was a carefully constructed national identity manual, a survival guide for a people on the brink of extinction. At the center of this narrative, they placed a radical idea. Their God, Yahweh, was not a local god defeated by the gods of Babylon. No, Yahweh was the one true God, the creator of the universe, the only God that existed. And the defeat, the exile, the suffering, it was not a sign of his weakness. It was a sign of his anger at Israel's disobedience. The entire narrative was flipped on its head. Exile was not an end, but an educational punishment, a temporary correction. And they, the Jewish people, were the chosen people, not for their merits, not because they were better, but for an eternal pact that guaranteed their survival and their return to the land. God had promised it, and God does not break his promises. This was the message: hold on, stay faithful, you will return. Suddenly, everything made sense. The insistence on circumcision, the dietary laws, the Sabbath rest, these were not arbitrary mandates from a capricious deity. They were markers of identity, cultural walls designed to make assimilation impossible. You could not blend into Babylonian society if you refused to eat their food. You could not disappear into the empire if you rested on a different day than everyone else. You could not forget who you were if your body itself bore the mark of the covenant. Belief in a single God and a chosen destiny was not just theology. It was a national survival strategy. It created an identity so strong that it could withstand the pressure of an empire. An identity that said, we are different. We have always been different. We will always be different. And we will never disappear. Spinoza had seen the political logic behind the veil of faith. The election was not a gift from God descending from heaven. It was a shield forged by men in the hell of exile. It was human ingenuity at its finest, the creation of an idea powerful enough to outlast empires. And it worked. Against all odds, it worked. The Jewish people survived when dozens of other conquered nations disappeared without a trace. But the story does not end there. Because Spinoza's idea of analyzing religion as a political construct was the key that opened countless doors, It was the first step toward a completely new understanding of how national myths are created and used to serve power interests. This understanding, this revelation of how theology can be a mask for politics, is what made Spinoza the most subversive thinker of the modern era. Because if he was right about Israel's election, what other sacred dogmas had we been lied to about? The question resonated in salons and cafes across Europe, whispered in secret meetings, debated behind closed doors, and the answer Spinoza began to outline was even more explosive than his analysis of the election itself. Think about it. If one of the oldest and most powerful religious ideas in history was actually a political strategy, then what else might be? What other truths have been dressed up as divine mandates to control populations? What other systems of power have hidden behind the shield of sacred authority? But before exploring those other revelations, you need to understand exactly how Spinoza arrived at his conclusions, the method he used. Because this method not only debunked an ancient myth, it created a model to challenge any authority that claims to be infallible. Kings who say they rule by divine right, churches that claim exclusive access to salvation, nations that insist they have a manifest destiny, all of them used the same playbook that the ancient Hebrew leaders used. And Spinoza gave us the tools to see through it. This model, this Spinozist scalpel, is what allows us today, 3.5 centuries later, to understand why the idea of choice remains so powerful and so dangerous. It explains why nations still invoke God when they go to war, why leaders still claim to speak for the divine when they pass laws, why groups still insist they are special, chosen, superior to others. The mechanics have not changed, only the names and the faces have changed. Imagine being handed a country's constitution and told it is a love poem. For centuries, everyone read it like a poem, marveling at its mystical beauty, feeling moved by its spiritual depth. But Spinoza did something different. He ignored the poem label and began to read it as what it actually was, a constitution, a legal document, a framework for organizing power. He analyzed its laws, its precedents, its objectives. He looked at who benefited from each provision. He examined who gained power and who lost it. And this was his revolutionary method. It revealed that the supposed poem was in fact a brilliant political document, a manual for building and maintaining a cohesive state in hostile conditions. Let me show you exactly how he did it. First, Spinoza established a fundamental rule. The Bible must interpret itself, not through the lens of later dogmas, not through rabbinic or ecclesiastical tradition. You have to analyze the language, the historical context, and the original author's intention. To do this, he studied Hebrew extensively, not as a sacred language imbued with mystical power, but as the language of an ancient people, just a language like any other, with grammar, idioms, and historical development. He applied this method to the concept of miracle. The Bible is full of them, and they are traditionally seen as proof of God's intervention and therefore of Israel's election. Parting seas, raining food from heaven, pillars of fire. These are the evidence that God chose Israel and actively intervened on their behalf. But Spinoza argued something radical. A miracle, a violation of the laws of nature, is a contradiction in terms. If God is nature, one of his most famous ideas, Deus sive natura, God or nature, then the laws of nature are God's will. They are not separate from God. They are the expression of God. Violating those laws would be like God contradicting himself, which is logically impossible. An omnipotent, rational God does not change his mind. He does not break his own rules. The laws of nature are fixed and eternal because they are divine. So what are biblical miracles? Spinoza concluded that they were simply natural phenomena that the ancients, with their limited knowledge, could not explain. They saw something they did not understand and attributed it to direct divine intervention. It is a natural human tendency. When we do not understand something, we call it magic or miracle. Manna from heaven. It could have been the resin of a desert shrub that appears seasonally. The parting of the Red Sea, a rare wind or tidal phenomenon that the Israelites took advantage of at exactly the right moment. The burning bush, a plant with flammable vapors that caught fire naturally. There are rational explanations for all of these events, if you look for them. By stripping miracles of their magic, Spinoza removed the primary evidence of divine intervention on behalf of Israel. If the miracles were natural events, then they were not proof of special divine favor, they were just fortunate timing and geographical circumstances. Israel was not saved by supernatural intervention, they were saved by luck, strategy, and human courage. Then he examined the prophets. Tradition saw them as mystical spokesmen who predicted the future, another proof of Israel's special relationship with God. Men who could see what was coming because God revealed it to them. But Spinoza read their texts and discovered something completely different. The prophets were not seers with magical foresight. They were incredibly eloquent political and social commentators, men with vivid imaginations and deep moral concerns who used powerful metaphors to criticize kings, denounce injustice, and call on the people to follow the law. They were the public intellectuals of their time, the social critics, the voice of conscience in a corrupt society. Their prophecies were not predictions of the future. They were warnings about the logical consequences of present actions. If you continue to oppress the poor, your kingdom will fall. If you worship foreign gods and abandon justice, you will be conquered. If you ignore the law and exploit the weak, disaster will come. That is not mysticism, that is socio-political analysis. It is cause and effect. It is wisdom born from observing how societies rise and fall. Spinoza demystified them, transforming them from magicians into public intellectuals, from supernatural oracles into shrewd observers of human nature and political reality. And once again, he removed another pillar that supposedly proved Israel's special status. If the prophets were not receiving divine downloads of future information, then their existence did not prove that God had a unique relationship with Israel. But this is where Spinoza's analysis becomes even more impressive. He went beyond just explaining what things were. He explained why they were created that way. He argued that the goal of the founders of the ancient Hebrew state was security and obedience. Like any state, they needed their citizens to follow laws, pay taxes, fight wars, and maintain social order. But how do you get people to obey? They created a system in which the laws of the state were presented as direct commandments from God, not suggestions from priests, not recommendations from kings, direct orders from the creator of the universe. Obedience to the king was obedience to God. Betrayal of the state was blasphemy against the divine. Breaking civil law was breaking cosmic law. This fusion of religion and politics created an incredibly stable and cohesive state, much more stable than states that relied on force alone. Because you can rebel against a king, you can overthrow a tyrant, but how do you rebel against God? You cannot. The system was genius because it made dissent not just illegal, but spiritually damning. The election was the ideological justification for this system. We obey these laws because we are God's people, and He gave them directly to us. We are different from other nations because we have a covenant with the Supreme Being. Our laws are not just human inventions, they are divine revelations. This makes them unquestionable, absolute, eternal. It is a much more effective form of government than simply saying, obey because the king says so. Because people can question kings, people can overthrow kings. But if the law comes from God, if breaking the law means breaking the covenant and losing divine protection, then obedience becomes a matter of survival, not just physical survival, but spiritual survival. And suddenly, biblical history no longer seems like a mystical saga, it seems like a political science textbook. Every story has a lesson about governance, about social cohesion, about the consequences of breaking the social contract. The story of the Tower of Babel, it is not about divine punishment for arrogance. It is a parable about the dangers of centralized power without a unifying ideology. When people cannot communicate, when they do not share a common vision, empires collapse. The story of the golden calf? It is not just about idolatry. It is about the political crisis that occurs when a leader disappears and the social pact is broken. Moses goes up the mountain, and within weeks the people create a new god. Why? Because they need authority. They need structure. They need something to organize their society around. Spinoza arrived at these conclusions 300 years before modern archaeology and textual criticism confirmed his intuitions. That is pure genius. He had no access to ancient Babylonian texts. He had no carbon dating. He had no comparative linguistics. He had only his reason, his knowledge of Hebrew, and his willingness to read the Bible as a human document rather than a divine one. And he got it right. Archaeologists today confirm that radical monotheism and the idea of an exclusive pact took hold during the period of exile, exactly as Spinoza deduced from pure logical analysis. The archaeological evidence shows that before the exile, the Israelites worshipped multiple gods. Yahweh was one among many. It was only after Babylon that the strict monotheism we recognize today became dominant. Historians confirm that the laws of the Pentateuch have striking parallels with other legal codes of the ancient Near East. The Code of Hammurabi, Hittite laws, Egyptian legal traditions. This suggests that they were not unique revelations handed down on stone tablets, but adaptations of a common legal tradition. Every society in that region had similar laws because they faced similar problems. The Torah was part of that world, not separate from it. But here is the most fascinating part. This does not make the Bible less important. It makes it important in a different way. When you remove the layer of divine revelation, what remains is a much more powerful narrative about human resilience, about creativity in the face of extinction, about the power of ideas to shape reality. The history of Israel, seen through the lens of Spinoza, is not the story of a God who chooses a people. It is the story of a people who, on the brink of extinction, choose themselves. A people who reinvent themselves through a powerful narrative, creating an identity so strong that it survives empires, exiles, and millennia. It is an astonishing testament to the power of ideas to shape history. And that is why Spinoza's idea was so dangerous to the institutions of his time. Because if Israel's election was a political construct designed to ensure national survival, what was to stop any other nation from claiming its own election for its own political purposes? What was to stop kings from saying God chose them? What was to stop empires from saying God ordained their conquests? And that is exactly what happened. Manifest destiny in the United States, the civilizing mission of the European empires, the Gott mit uns, God with us, inscribed on the belt buckles of German armies. They are all echoes of the same logic, the same formula that Spinoza dissected. The logic that we are special, we have a divine mission, and therefore our actions are justified. Whatever we do is right because God is on our side. Spinoza not only discovered the political origin of a religious dogma, he discovered the formula for the most toxic nationalism, the template that every empire, every expanding power, every colonial project has used to justify itself. We are not conquering, we are fulfilling destiny. We are not oppressing, we are civilizing. We are not destroying cultures, we are bringing the light of the true faith. And this discovery was just the beginning, because once you understand how the election narrative was constructed, you begin to see the same myth-making patterns everywhere, the same mechanisms operating in every culture, every nation, every ideology that claims special status. Take Christianity itself, for example. Spinoza applied his method to the Gospels with the same ruthless logic. The Christian narrative depends on Jesus being the fulfillment of Hebrew prophecies, the Messiah promised to the chosen people. This is the foundation of Christian theology. Jesus is the one the prophets foretold. His coming proves that the Bible is true and that God's plan is unfolding. But Spinoza, by analyzing these prophecies in their original context, showed that they did not refer to a future spiritual savior. They referred to kings and political events of their own time. When Isaiah spoke of a virgin bearing a son, he was talking about a sign for King Ahaz in the 8th century before Christ. When the prophets spoke of a coming deliverer, they meant a political leader who would restore Israel's independence, not a cosmic redeemer who would die for humanity's sins. The Gospel authors, according to Spinoza, searched the Hebrew Scriptures and creatively reinterpreted passages to build a case that Jesus was the foretold Messiah. It was not a divine fulfillment of ancient predictions. It was a brilliant piece of retrospective exegesis, a theological marketing campaign to sell a new movement to a Jewish audience. Look, everything was predicted. It was all part of the plan. Jesus is the one. Can you feel how radical this idea was in the 17th century, to suggest that the Gospels were constructed narratives rather than eyewitness reports of fulfilled prophecy? It was not just challenging Christianity, it was pulling out the foundation stone of the entire religion. But Spinoza went even further. He argued that the true message of figures like Jesus was not to found a new institutional religion with dogmas and rituals. The message was simple and universal. Love your neighbor. That is it. Nothing more complicated than that. Spinoza believed that this ethical core was the heart of all true religion. The only thing that mattered, how you treat other people. But institutions, both the synagogue and the church, had buried this simple message under layers of laws, dogmas, and, above all, the idea of election. Our way is the only right way. We are the chosen ones. We have the truth. Everyone else is lost. For Spinoza, this was the fundamental corruption of religion, the transformation of a universal ethic of love into a tribal politics of exclusion. Spinoza documented all of this with meticulous care, and the more he wrote, the clearer it became that the idea of election was not a divine gift. It was a trap that bred pride, led to contempt for others, and ultimately prevented people from recognizing the divinity present in every human being, not just in members of their own group, not just in people who believed the right things, but in everyone. The idea of being chosen creates an us versus them mentality. It divides humanity into the saved and the damned, the enlightened and the ignorant, the special and the ordinary. And once you accept that division, once you believe your group has exclusive access to truth or divine favor, then anything you do to outsiders can be justified. They are not really equal to you. They do not have what you have. They are less than. In 1673, Spinoza received an offer that could have changed his life. The University of Heidelberg, one of the most prestigious universities in Europe, offered him a chair in philosophy. This was an incredible honor. Security, recognition, a platform for his ideas, a salary that would free him from grinding lens. He could have had respect, comfort, intellectual community, everything a philosopher could want. There was only one condition. He was not to disturb the publicly established religion. Just do not upset the church. Teach philosophy, write your books, share your ideas, but do not challenge the religious authorities. Stay within the boundaries. Play it safe. Spinoza rejected the offer. In his reply letter, he explained that he did not know how he could philosophize freely without appearing to be disturbing religion, because real philosophy asks uncomfortable questions. Real philosophy does not respect boundaries drawn by political power. Real philosophy goes wherever the truth leads, regardless of who it offends. He chose freedom over security. He chose truth over prestige. He chose to remain faithful to his discovery that organized religions, with their claims of election and exclusive truth, were often the greatest obstacle to true philosophy and true ethics. They demanded conformity when philosophy required questioning. They punished doubt when philosophy required questionism. They claimed certainty when philosophy required humility. Certainty when philosophy required humility. Certainty when philosophy required humility. When philosophy required questioning, certainty when philosophy required humility. Spinoza spent the last years of his life polishing lenses to survive and refining his arguments in his masterpiece, Ethics. He lived simply, almost in poverty, in rented rooms with few possessions. But he was free. Free to think, free to write, free to follow the truth wherever it led. And he knew the cost of that freedom. He died in 1677 at the age of 44, probably from a lung disease aggravated by the glass dust in his workshop. The same work that supported him also slowly killed him. But even in death, his ideas would not die with him. The history of his manuscripts is a saga in itself. Knowing that the authorities would confiscate his papers, Spinoza's friends hatched a daring plan. Hours after his death, they packed up his unpublished manuscripts, including the Ethics, and secretly sent them to a printer in Amsterdam. They moved quickly, quietly, before anyone could stop them. They published his complete works posthumously and anonymously, without his name on the cover. The Dutch government, under pressure from Calvinists, immediately banned the books. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Spinoza's ideas, especially his critique of politicized religion, spread like wildfire throughout Europe. Underground networks passed copies from hand to hand. Philosophers read them by candlelight. Students smuggled them across borders. The ideas were too powerful to suppress. These ideas fueled the Enlightenment and laid the groundwork for the modern idea of a secular state. The separation of church and state, the idea that government should not enforce religious doctrine, the concept of freedom of conscience. All of these trace back to Spinoza. He was the first to argue systematically that religion and politics must be separated for both to function properly. Documents from the time reveal that the religious authorities fully understood the danger. If Spinoza was right that election was a political construct, then their own authority, which was based on being the heirs of that pact, was also a political construct. Their power was not of divine origin, it was human. It was invented. It was maintained through claims that could be questioned. And what humans build, humans can dismantle. This terrified them. Because if people realized that religious authority was just another form of political power, they might stop obeying. They might start questioning. They might demand justification for laws and doctrines that had always been accepted as divine will. They could not allow it. So they launched a smear campaign that lasted 2 centuries. They made sure that Spinozist became synonymous with immoral atheist. They burned his books wherever they found them. They distorted his ideas, presenting him as a monster who wanted to destroy all morality and social order. They told people he denied God, denied virtue, denied everything good and decent. And it worked. For almost 200 years, Spinoza was the most vilified philosopher in Europe. His name was a curse word. Parents warned their children not to read him. Universities banned his books from their libraries. Priests thundered against him from pulpits. He became the embodiment of everything dangerous about free thinking. Only at the end of the 19th century, with the rise of historical critical study of the Bible, did scholars begin to realize that the Amsterdam heretic was 200 years ahead of his time. Archaeologists started confirming his timeline. Linguists verified his analysis of Hebrew texts. Historians recognized his insights into the political function of religion. His analyses, which seemed blasphemous in the 17th century, became the basis of modern biblical scholarship. Everything we understand today about how the Bible was written, edited, and compiled owes a debt to Spinoza. He was the first. He walked into the darkness alone, and he left a map for everyone who came after. And the implications of this go far beyond theology, far beyond ancient history, far beyond debates about what happened 3,000 years ago, because if the founding idea of a civilization, the chosen people, was a political strategy, then what other sacred truths are political strategies, dressed up as divine mandates? The divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs rule by God's will and cannot be questioned. That is a political strategy. It keeps people obedient and prevents rebellion. National mission, the belief that your country has a special role to play in history, a destiny to fulfill. That is a political strategy. It justifies expansion, war, and domination. the exceptionalism of a superpower. The conviction that your nation is uniquely virtuous, uniquely important, uniquely justified in its actions. That is a political strategy. It manufactures consent for policies that would otherwise be questioned. These are not speculations. These are legitimate questions that Spinoza taught us to ask. He gave us a method to detect when theology is used as an alibi for ideology, when God talk is really power talk, when claims about the sacred are really claims about control. Spinoza's method is timeless. It works just as well today as it did 3.5 centuries ago. When a nation justifies a war by claiming it has a special moral mission, Spinoza whispers in our ear, who benefits from this narrative? What resources are being secured? What populations are being controlled? What power is trying to legitimize itself with divine language? When a political leader claims to speak in the name of God or the true people, Spinoza pushes us to ask deeper questions. What specific laws is he trying to impose? What freedoms is he trying to restrict? Who gains power from this claim, and who loses it? Strip away the religious language and look at the actual political effects. When any group claims to be chosen or inherently superior, when they insist they have special access to truth or special rights that others do not have, Spinoza warns us to look for the political agenda hidden behind the metaphysical pretension. What are they trying to justify? What are they trying to exclude? Who are they defining as the enemy, and why? 350 years later, Spinoza's discovery about Israel's election remains incredibly relevant, not because it tells us anything specific about Jews or Judaism, but because it tells us something universal about humanity. It teaches us how we build collective identities. It shows us the power of stories to unite people, for better and for worse, and it warns us of the danger of believing that our story is the only one that matters. Today, when we see the resurgence of nationalisms that speak of cultural purity and historical destinies, we are witnessing a modern version of the same mechanism that Spinoza dissected. The same logic of election, stripped of its theological language, but retaining all its power of exclusion. The same idea that we are special and they are not. That our group has virtue and theirs has vice. That our story is true and theirs is false. The mechanics have not changed in 3,000 years. Only the vocabulary has changed. We do not say chosen by God as often anymore. Now we say historically destined or culturally superior or defending our way of life. But the function is identical, to create a boundary between us and them, to justify treating others as less than fully human, to claim rights and privileges that we deny to outsiders. True intellectual courage is not questioning other people's myths. That is easy. That costs nothing. True courage is questioning the myths that sustain your own identity, the stories your community tells about itself, the narratives that make you feel special, chosen, superior. Those are the hard ones to examine because questioning them means questioning yourself. Spinoza, a Jew, questioned the founding myth of Judaism, the very idea that gave his people identity, cohesion, and purpose through millennia of persecution. It cost him his community, his safety, and his reputation. He was excommunicated, attacked, vilified. He lived in exile from his own people. He died young and poor and alone. But he gained something much greater than what he lost. He gained a universal perspective, an understanding that the only choice that matters is the ethical choice each individual makes, to treat others fairly and lovingly, no matter what tribe they belong to, no matter what God they worship, no matter what nation they were born in. The only election that has moral weight is the choice to be human with other humans. Today we have tools that Spinoza could only dream of. We have archaeology that can date texts and artifacts with precision. We have genetics that can trace population movements. We have data analysis that can compare thousands of documents instantly. We have access to information that would have seemed like magic to a 17th century lens grinder. But we often lack what he had in abundance, the courage to apply reason to our most cherished beliefs. The willingness to follow an argument wherever it leads, even if it leads to uncomfortable conclusions. The integrity to choose truth over belonging. We have more tools, but less courage. More information, but less wisdom. We have his example, though. We know that it is possible to critically analyze narratives of power without falling into nihilism. We know that stripping away mystification does not leave us with nothing. It leaves us with something better. The truth. And the truth, however stark, is always more liberating than a beautiful lie. We know that it is possible to find a basis for ethics not in a divine decree for a single people, but in the universal reason shared by all humanity. We do not need to be chosen to have worth. We do not need a special covenant to have dignity. We do not need divine favor to have purpose. We have worth because we exist. We have dignity because we are human. We have purpose because we can choose to make life better for others. Israel's election was not a supernatural event. It was not God reaching down from heaven and tapping one nation on the shoulder saying, "You are mine." It was an act of socio-political genius, a survival strategy created by desperate leaders trying to prevent their people from disappearing. It became one of the most powerful ideas in history, shaping not just Judaism, but Christianity, Islam, and the entire Western conception of history and destiny. And that truth, the truth that Spinoza uncovered, is deeper, more instructive, and more human than the myth that hid it. Because the truth about election teaches us something that myth cannot. It teaches us that identities are not given from heaven. They are constructed on earth, by people, in specific historical circumstances, for specific reasons. Nations are projects, not essences. There is no mystical substance that makes one people fundamentally different from another. There is no divine quality that makes one group chosen and another rejected. There are only human communities creating stories about themselves, building institutions, making choices about how to organize their collective life. History is not predetermined by divine will. It is forged by human decisions, by leaders who choose war or peace, by communities that choose inclusion or exclusion, by individuals who choose courage or conformity. Every moment is a choice. Every generation decides what kind of world it will create. These are lessons we desperately need today. Lessons that are more urgent now than in Spinoza's time. Because today, as then, we are surrounded by narratives of choice that divide us. Narratives that tell us that our group is virtuous and the other is a threat. Narratives that use a mythologized past to justify an unjust present. We are told that our nation has a special mission, that our culture is superior, that our way of life must be defended against contamination, that we have rights that others do not have because of who we are, because of our history, because of our identity. And all of these narratives use the same logic that Spinoza dissected. The logic of election, the logic of us versus them. The story of Israel's election, revealed through Spinoza's work, is not just about the past. It is about the now. It is about understanding the universal mechanism of how division is created, how fear is manufactured, how people are taught to see other humans as threats rather than as fellow travelers in this brief and difficult life. And it is about how critical thinking, the courageous application of reason, is the only tool we have to dismantle those walls. Not violence, not counter-narratives that create new divisions, but reason, logic, the willingness to ask, is this really true? Who benefits from me believing this? What am I not seeing because this story is in the way? Truth emerges in different ways throughout history. Sometimes through a solitary philosopher like Spinoza, working alone in a workshop, asking questions that no one else dared to ask. Sometimes through historians who unearth uncomfortable truths that challenge official narratives. Sometimes through ordinary citizens who get tired of being told they are special and decide they would rather just be human alongside the rest of humanity. Questioning is not just intellectual exercise, it is moral action. Questioning not only reveals the origin of an idea, it reveals its function. It reveals who benefits from it being believed. What interests does it protect? What broader truth does it obscure? What possibilities does it close off? When you ask these questions, the world starts to look different. It reveals that other, more inclusive and universal forms of identity are possible. We do not have to organize ourselves into tribes competing for divine favor. We do not have to see history as a zero-sum game where one group wins and everyone else loses. We can recognize that we are all in this together, that every human being has the same fundamental worth, that no group has a monopoly on truth or virtue or destiny. Spinoza's discovery about election was just the first piece of a much larger domino, the domino of revelation-based authority. Authority that says, you must obey because God said so, and I speak for God. When that piece fell, it shook all the others. Every claim to divine mandate, every assertion of sacred hierarchy, every system that demands obedience without justification, when that piece fell, people started asking, how do you know God said that? How do you know you speak for God? What if you are just speaking for yourself and using God's name to make me obey? And those questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. Every time someone applies Spinoza's method to a national dogma, an accepted economic truth, or an official historical narrative, they are pushing the next domino. And the panorama that emerges is extraordinary. It is the panorama of a humanity that does not need myths of choice to find meaning. A humanity that can find wonder not in supernatural intervention, but in the immutable laws of nature, in the fact that we exist at all, in the beauty of a universe that operates by rational principles we can discover and understand. A humanity that can find morality not in tribal commandments that divide people into chosen and rejected, but in universal reason, in the recognition that every human being suffers, loves, hopes, and fears just like you do, that what you would not want done to yourself, you should not do to others. It is that simple and that profound. A world where a person's worth depends not on the group they belong to, the God they worship, or the nation they were born in, but on their ability to think, love, and cooperate, on whether they add to the sum of human flourishing or subtract from it, on whether they build bridges or walls. This future is not guaranteed. It is not inevitable. It will not arrive simply because we wait for it. It requires effort. It requires the courage of Spinoza, the willingness to be a heretic in the face of the orthodoxies of our time, the willingness to lose everything for the sake of truth. And the proof that it is possible lies in the story of a young lens grinder in Amsterdam who decided that understanding the truth was more important than belonging, more important than safety, more important than comfort. He made that choice, and he paid the price. But he also succeeded. The truth he unearthed survived centuries of defamation. It survived book burnings and bans. It survived the smear campaigns and the distortions. It survived because truth has a quality that lies do not have. Truth corresponds to reality, and reality, eventually, always wins. You can suppress truth for a while, but you cannot kill it. It keeps coming back. Today, that truth is a tool at our disposal, not just as a history lesson, not just as an interesting intellectual puzzle about what ancient people believed, but as a manual for the future, a guide for how to think about the stories we are told today, how to evaluate the claims made by leaders, institutions, and ideologies that demand our loyalty. It is a future where the truth always finds a way, even when it has to wait 300 years, even when it challenges the foundation of our identity, even when it reveals that the stories we tell ourselves to feel special are the same ones that prevent us from being truly free. Because as long as you believe you are chosen, you cannot see others as equals. As long as you believe your group has special access to truth, you cannot learn from outsiders. As long as you believe your story is the only story that matters, you are trapped in a prison of your own making. Truth always finds a way, And when it emerges, as it did through Spinoza, it not only illuminates what was hidden, it illuminates who we are when we have the courage to live without comforting myths. It illuminates who we can become when we stop seeking the approval of a tribal god and begin to recognize the divinity in the face of every human being. Not divinity in a supernatural sense, but the capacity for reason, the ability to suffer and to love, that we all share. That is Spinoza's legacy. That is the lesson of choice. And that is the opportunity we have. The opportunity to choose reason over dogma, to choose humanity over tribe, to choose the courage of inquiry over the comfort of blind faith, to choose truth even when it costs us everything. Because if the history of election teaches us anything, it is this: the truth is not given to us from above. The truth is not handed down on tablets or whispered by angels. The truth is something we must build with effort and courage here below, in the messy, complicated, beautiful world of human existence, through observation, through reasoning, through the difficult work of questioning what we have been taught and testing it against reality. And that task, that choice, is the only one that really matters. Not whether you belong to the chosen people or the rejected people. Not whether your nation has a divine mission or your group has special virtue. But whether you choose to live as a thinking, questioning, compassionate human being. Whether you choose to see others as they are, fellow humans struggling through the same existence, rather than as threats or inferiors or enemies. That is the choice Spinoza made. That is the choice that is still before us. And the world we create depends entirely on which choice we make.